Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is John Barker Church, who's an extraordinarily interesting character. Now, there is no known image of John Barker Church. There's, however, this image. Those are dueling pistols, and we'll get back to those later. Anyway, John Barker Church was born in England to a fairly wealthy family, but he took up a gambling addiction despite his good education, and at just 26 years old found himself surrounded in debt. So he ran from England to the colonial North America, though this is just as the American Revolutionary War is breaking out, and he was able to finagle himself a position to sell arms to several colonial militias. And this was obviously a very lucrative business, and he seemed to be good at it because he struck up a friendship with many people in the Continental Congress. And the Continental Congress then sent him and two other men north to do an audit of the Northern Department. Now, I should note that John Barker Church, when he fled to America, he was hiding his identity, so he started parading as John Carter. Again, despite this, he made a tidy little fortune selling arms, and the Continental Congress sent him to the Northern Department to do this audit. Now, as Carter, he is supposed to audit Major General Philip Schuyler, and if the name Philip Schuyler rings a bell, it's because his daughters were fairly famous in the, I don't want to say new, but the play Hamilton. Now, what's interesting about this is in the musical Hamilton, well, Angelica Schuyler says offhand how she's supposed to marry rich, and she finds a husband who is not a lot of fun. Well, in reality, the person she found was John Barker Church, who was at the time running under an assumed identity, John Carter. Now, General Philip Schuyler does not like this Carter fella who shows up to audit him. Obviously, why would you like someone who's auditing you? He also doesn't know who Carter's family is. The play did get it right. It was very important to know about the family of the person you are marrying your daughter off to. But since Carter was under assumed name, of course they didn't know anything about the family. Now, unlike what the play implies, Angelica Schuyler and John Barker Church end up eloping. Now, it's not clear whether or not Angelica knew that John was under an assumed identity at this point. More than likely he informed her, but it would be several years, and we'll get to that, before they actually announce their real family name. Either way, Angelica and John Barker Church elope and run off to France, essentially. Now, at the time, it wasn't actually the father who wanted to have their daughter marry rich. Well, they did, of course, but in Albany and in much of New York, they had Dutch ancestry, and therefore it was actually up to the mother to determine who their daughter might marry. So, of course, when Angelica eloped, her mother, Catherine, was quite heartbroken, as we've mentioned in a discussion with Jessie Sir Filippi when she came on recently. Either way, the John Barker Church ends up partnering with the Woodworth family. I'm sorry, not the Woodworth family, the Wadsworth family, specifically Jeremiah Wadsworth. And they end up getting first they start supplying the French when the French army shows up in the United States, and then they actually get the only contract to supply the Continental Army with its arms. And this was, of course, extraordinarily lucrative. And after making all this money, the Continental Congress actually sends John Barker Church over to France, as I mentioned, as a consul regarding the friendship with France. And this is just as Benjamin Franklin's handing the reins over to Thomas Jefferson, for some context. And it is only in France in 1784 that John Barker Carter and Angelica Carter announced to the world that their real names are John Barker and Angelica Church. Now, this should shock people, but things seem to be going swimmingly because they end up making enough money where John could pay off his debts, and they move back to England. And what happens? Well, John gets elected as a member of Parliament, despite having supplied arms and ammunition to the American revolutionaries, and despite Angelica being the daughter of a prominent revolutionary and sister-in-law to Alexander Hamilton, another prominent revolutionary. He still goes to Parliament and spends 6 years in Parliament. Now, unfortunately, Angelica dies fairly young. John Barker Church does return to the United States and actually invests a lot in land, especially in upstate New York. He buys a lot of it from his friend Robert Morris, who is as you probably know, is an extremely important American founder who unfortunately found himself in some financial troubles due to land speculation in western and central New York. And that's why John Barker Church tries to buy it from him. It really doesn't help as much as it should, but Barker Church is able to continue making a fortune on those particular purchases. And John Barker Church lives out the rest of his life. He does return to England at some point, and unfortunately does squander much of his fortune. Now, what's really interesting here are these. These are dueling pistols, as I mentioned before. You see, when John Barker Church came back to the United States, he actually fights in a duel. Who does he fight with, you ask? Well, none other than Aaron Burr. Now, both men are fine in that, and these pistols are not used in that fight, but these pistols are owned by John Barker Church. And John Barker Church lets his nephew-in-law, or I guess his nephew, Philip Hamilton, use these in a duel. And, well, that duel doesn't go so well for Philip Hamilton, as you might know. He is the son of Alexander Hamilton and sister-in-law and wife to Hamilton, Eliza Schuyler Hamilton. And Philip ends up dying after the duel. And then these same guns are used 3 years later by Philip's father, Alexander Hamilton, who uses his brother-in-law's guns when he also duels Aaron Burr, the same man his brother-in-law, John Barker Church, had previously dueled. Unlike the duel with Church, Burr makes a connection with one of his shots with Alexander Hamilton, and the rest, as they say, is history. So that is a brief overview of the life of John Barker Church. He gets a bad rap for essentially being not abstained from or omitted from the play, the Broadway musical Hamilton. And like I said, at one line, Angelica Schuyler Church says he's not a lot of fun. And he ran around under an assumed identity for several years. He ran guns for the United States in the Revolutionary War. He ends up representing the United States to France. And then he goes and becomes a minister to Parliament as the member of the House of Commons. And then he also supplies the dueling pistols that kill off Hamilton and his son. So, of course, a play of that nature needs to take some artistic license, but I hope you've learned today that John Barker Church, whatever you think of his character, certainly seems to have been a whole lot of fun. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit like, and if you're new here, subscribe. I put out content about the American Revolution all week long, including on Fridays where we do trivia. So look forward to that on Friday, and tomorrow is Thursday actually, so we'll be doing a weekly wrap-up of the last 7 articles published on my website, Founder of the Day. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back with that weekly wrap-up tomorrow.